My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 60 years old today, and my life's work has been a quiet and deeply passionate study of patronage. I was, until my recent retirement, a professor of art history, specializing in the Italian Renaissance. My world was not just one of beautiful paintings, but of the intricate and often brutal human relationships that made their creation possible. I understood the delicate, and often ruthless, dance between the artist and the patron, the creator and the funder. I taught my students that behind every great masterpiece, behind every brushstroke of a Botticelli or a Titian, there is a story of power, of ambition, of loyalty, and very often of betrayal. A patron, I would explain, does not just buy a painting. They buy a piece of the artist's soul, a piece of history, a testament to their own taste and their own legacy. My own life, for the past 30 years, has been an exercise in a different and much more personal form of patronage. I have been the primary and silent patron of my own family. My husband, Richard, was a man of immense charm and even more immense ambition. He was a brilliant corporate lawyer who built a formidable empire. And I, with my modest professor's salary and a significant inheritance from my own art-loving family, was his first and most loyal investor. I did not just support his career, I curated it. I hosted the dinners, I cultivated the clients, I edited his articles for the law review. I was the quiet, Medici-like force behind the throne of his success. Our only daughter, Lily, was the masterpiece of our shared collection. She was raised in a world of beauty, of privilege, of effortless grace. She was given the best of everything, the best schools, the best clothes, a life scrubbed clean of any hardship or want. And I, in my love for her, became her ultimate patron. I funded her education, her travels, her every whim. My love was a blank check, a bottomless trust fund of emotional and financial support. The great sacrifice, the one that would ultimately lead to the complete and total bankruptcy of my own heart, came 2 years ago when Richard announced he was leaving me. It was not a dramatic, tear-filled scene. It was a corporate restructuring. He had, he informed me, found a new and much wealthier partner. A woman named Caroline, the heiress to a shipping fortune. A woman who was younger, sleeker, and a much more strategic merger for his expanding empire. The divorce was a brutal, but quiet, negotiation. I was not a fool. I had a good lawyer. But I was a mother. And my primary concern was not my own financial security, but Lily's. She was in her final year at a very expensive university, and she was caught in the crossfire of our collapsed marriage. To protect her, to shield her from the ugliness of it all, to ensure that her world, her beautiful, effortless, and deeply entitled world, would not be disrupted, I made a series of profound and deeply foolish concessions. I did not fight for the house. I did not fight for the stock portfolio. I let him have it all, in exchange for a simple and legally binding agreement. He would continue to fund Lily's lifestyle, her education, her future, at the level to which she had become accustomed. I, in turn, would walk away with my own, much smaller, inheritance and my dignity. But I kept one thing. One, small, and in his eyes, insignificant asset. It was a painting. A small, exquisite, and largely unknown portrait from the studio of Bronzino, a jewel of late Renaissance mannerism. It had been in my family for generations, a quiet and deeply loved piece of our own personal history. To Richard, a man who saw art as an investment, it was a pretty but minor piece, worth a fraction of the Rothkos and the Warhols that he had so eagerly claimed in the divorce. He let me keep it, a final condescending gesture of his own magnanimous generosity. And I, in turn, in a final and deeply symbolic act of maternal patronage, created a trust for my daughter. I placed the Bronzino, my one, true, and most precious treasure, into that trust. The terms were simple. The painting, which had always hung in Lily's bedroom, would remain there. And upon her marriage, the trust would be dissolved, and the painting would become her sole and unassailable property. It was her dowry. her inheritance. The final, and most beautiful, gift from a mother who had already given her everything. I, in turn, moved into a small, elegant, and quiet, new apartment. I began to rebuild my life. I had my books, my work, my few true and loyal friends. And I had my daughter. Or so I thought. The slow and deeply, deeply painful process of my own, final and total erasure from my daughter's life, was a masterpiece of passive aggression, a campaign of 1,000 tiny and exquisitely cruel social cuts. It was a war of attrition, and it was being waged, I soon realized, not by my daughter, but by her new and very powerful stepmother, Caroline. Caroline, the new Mrs. Richard Vance, was a woman who understood power. She knew that to secure her own position as the new and undisputed matriarch of the Vance dynasty, she had to not just replace me, but to completely and utterly erase me. And her primary weapon, her chosen battlefield, was my own, and only, daughter. It began with a series of accidental scheduling conflicts. The weekly, sacred mother-daughter dinners we had maintained for years were suddenly and repeatedly canceled. "Oh, Mom, I'm so sorry," Lily's voice, a thin and increasingly brittle instrument of apology, would say over the phone. "But Caroline has just surprised us with tickets to the opera. I can't say no, you understand." Then came the slow and systematic colonization of her affections. Caroline, the magnificent and infinitely wealthy patron, began to shower my daughter with a level of luxury I could never hope to compete with. There were trips to Paris for couture fittings. There were weekends in the Hamptons. There was a new and very expensive sports car for her graduation gift. I, with my modest professor's pension, could only offer a first edition book of poetry. I was a quiet and increasingly dowdy little tugboat, trying to compete with a gleaming and very, very powerful ocean liner. And Lily, my daughter, the girl I had raised in a world of art, of history, of the enduring and quiet power of the things that last, was dazzled. She was seduced. She chose the glitter. She chose the gold. She chose the new, and much more exciting, story that was being offered to her. And in that story I was a minor and increasingly inconvenient character from a boring and deeply unfashionable prequel. The final, public, and exquisitely, almost artistically, cruel act of my own and final erasure was scheduled, with a sense of an almost literary irony, for my 60th birthday. It was my first birthday since the divorce. My first birthday, in 30 years, alone. I was, I admit, feeling a profound sense of self-pity. The day loomed, a gray and deeply dreaded monolith on my calendar. And then, a week before, Lily called. Her voice was full of a bright and deeply, deeply false, and now painfully familiar, cheerfulness. "Mom," she'd chirp, "I know we haven't seen much of each other. I've been so busy, but your big day, we have to celebrate. I am taking you out. To your favorite restaurant, just the two of us, my treat." The old, foolish, and deeply, deeply stubborn mother in me, the part of me that refused to believe the worst, dared to hope. Maybe I had been wrong. Maybe she was still my daughter. Maybe, just maybe, she still loved me. The day arrived. I spent the afternoon preparing. I bought a new dress. I did my hair. I sat in my quiet apartment, and I waited. And I waited. The reservation was for 7. At 7:30, she had not arrived. At 8, my phone buzzed. It was a text message from her. I opened it. My hands were trembling. It read, "Mom, I am so. Something has come up at work. A huge, last-minute, emergency presentation. I can't get out of it. I'm so sorry. I will make it up to you. I promise. I feel terrible. Happy birthday. I love you. Ye feel terrible. Only." The lie was so bald, so clumsy, so deeply and profoundly insulting in its lack of effort, that it was almost comical. But I did not laugh. I simply sat there, in my new, and now deeply, deeply pathetic dress, and I felt the last, lingering and foolish ember of my hope go cold. But then, a new and unfamiliar feeling began to stir. It was not sadness. It was a cold and quiet and deeply, deeply academic curiosity. I was a scholar of human nature, of the intricate and often brutal webs of power and betrayal. And I had just been presented with a fascinating and deeply, deeply personal case study. I wanted to see the primary source material for myself. I did not cancel the reservation. I went. Alone. I walked into the restaurant, my favorite, old, and deeply, deeply elegant Italian restaurant, a place that was a quiet and beautiful, and now heartbreakingly poignant, archive of my own and former life. And I asked for a small, quiet, and very, very discreet table in the corner. And I sat. And I ordered a glass of the best Barolo on the menu. And I waited. And then, at precisely 8:30, I saw them. They did not see me. I was a ghost, a shadow, in a quiet, dark corner. But I saw them. In the best and most prominent table in the entire and very crowded restaurant, the table that was reserved for the most important of patrons, sat my daughter, Lily. And beside her, my ex-husband, Richard. And across from them, in the seat that had once been mine, sat Caroline, the new Mrs. Vance, looking radiant and beautiful and deeply triumphant. And in the center of the table was a small, beautiful, and exquisitely decorated birthday cake. And on that cake was a single and very, very happy candle. They were not at a business meeting. They were at a party, a celebration. My daughter, on the night of my 60th birthday, a night she had canceled on me because of work, was in fact at a different and clearly much more important birthday party for her new and much, much wealthier and much, much more useful mother, Caroline darling. I sat in my corner, and I watched. I watched them laugh. I watched them toast. I watched my daughter, my only child, present Caroline with a gift, a beautifully wrapped box from a very, very expensive jewelry store. And I felt a coldness so profound, so absolute, that it seemed to stop my own, and very, very tired, and very, very broken heart. The betrayal was not just in the lie. It was in the poetics, in the sheer and breathtaking and almost artistic cruelty of the symmetry. He had replaced me, and now she had replaced me, my own daughter. And my replacement's birthday, it was the same day as my own. I did not cause a scene. I did not confront them. I simply sat, and I watched, and I gathered my data. And the old, and quiet, and deeply, deeply heartbroken professor of art history of the art of the patron died in that corner. And in her place, a new woman was born. A woman who was calm. A woman who was cold. And a woman who had just realized that the beautiful and priceless and deeply, deeply underestimated work of art that she had so generously and so foolishly gifted to her daughter was held in a trust with a very, very precise and a very, very interesting set of rules. And the time had come, I decided, for a new and very, very strict curatorial review. I sat in my dark corner of the restaurant, a ghost at 2 birthday feasts, and I watched the story unfold. The initial, searing, and almost blinding pain of the betrayal began to recede, and in its place, a strange and deeply, deeply cold clarity began to dawn. I was no longer a mother watching her daughter's cruel betrayal. I was a scholar, an art historian, observing a fascinating and deeply, deeply flawed masterpiece of human treachery. And the scholar, I discovered, was not heartbroken. The scholar was intrigued. They had made a critical and deeply, deeply amateurish mistake. They had assumed that the object of their patronage, The quiet and seemingly powerless old woman was as sentimental and as foolish as she appeared. They had forgotten my life's work. They had forgotten that I was a woman who had spent a lifetime studying the fine print, the hidden meanings, the secret, and often brutal contracts that exist beneath the beautiful and often deceptive surface of a work of art. My mind, the mind of a woman who could deconstruct the complex and often vicious politics of a Medici court, began to work. This was not a family drama. This was a contractual dispute, a matter of patronage. And the patron, I now understood, with a beautiful and deeply, deeply satisfying clarity, had been a fool. But she had been a fool with a very, very good lawyer. My secret weapon was not a sudden, brilliant, and vengeful idea. It was a memory. A quiet and dusty, and now suddenly, brilliantly illuminated memory of a conversation in a lawyer's office a year ago. I remembered the day I had created the trust for the Bronzino painting. My lawyer, a shrewd and deeply, deeply loyal old friend named Arthur, had been the one to suggest the final and most brilliant clause. "A gift of this magnitude, Eleanor," he had said, his voice a low and wise and deeply pragmatic rumble, "should not be unconditional. A patron has a right to expect loyalty, a certain decorum from the beneficiary." And so we had drafted it. The patron's clause. It was a simple and beautiful and utterly and completely lethal piece of legal prose. It stated that the trust and the painting within it would be transferred to my daughter, Lily, upon her marriage, under one single and non-negotiable condition. The condition was that she must, at all times, demonstrate a continued and demonstrable sense of familial loyalty and personal respect for the original benefactor. That was me. And then, the final and most beautiful brushstroke of Arthur's legal masterpiece. The clause stated that the sole and final arbiter of what constituted this loyalty and respect would not be me. It would not be the courts. It would be a single and named independent trustee, a man whose judgment in all matters of art and of loyalty I trusted implicitly. My oldest and dearest friend, a man named David Chen, the most respected and the most feared art dealer in the city. Richard, my ex-husband, had known about the trust, of course, but he had dismissed it. He had seen the painting as a minor and sentimental asset. He had, I now knew, with a certainty that was as cold and as hard as a diamond, vastly and fatally underestimated its true and current market value. And Lily, my daughter, had signed the trust documents with the same casual and deeply, deeply bored indifference with which she had signed so many other documents I had placed in front of her. She had seen it as a formality, a piece of paper that stood between her and the pretty, old, and slightly boring painting that had always hung on her bedroom wall. They had no idea. They had no idea that the painting was a masterpiece. And they had no idea that the trust was a masterpiece of a different and much, much more brutal kind. My decision was not a decision. It was a conclusion, a logical and deeply, deeply satisfying deduction based on the available and now overwhelming evidence. My daughter, by her actions tonight, by this public and exquisitely cruel act of disloyalty and disrespect, had not just broken my heart. She had breached the contract, and she had, in doing so, handed me and my trustee the legal and moral and deeply, deeply satisfying authority to do what a patron does when a beneficiary proves to be not just ungrateful but treacherous. She revokes the grant. I did not cause a scene. I did not storm their table. I simply and quietly finished my glass of wine. I paid my bill, and I walked out of that restaurant, out of that life, a quiet and deeply, deeply satisfied, and now very, very motivated art historian. The time for quiet and passive patronage was over. The time for a new, and much more, active form of curatorship was about to begin. My war was not a war of emotion. It was a war of connoisseurship, a quiet and deeply satisfying campaign of legal and art historical correspondence. My first act, on the morning of my 60th birthday, was not to weep into my pillow. It was to call my trustee. "David," I said, my voice not the voice of the heartbroken and humiliated woman from the night before, but the voice of a calm and very, very focused and very, very wealthy art collector. "It's Eleanor. I have a small and rather urgent curatorial matter I need to discuss with you. It concerns the Bronzino d'Or." I met him that afternoon, in his quiet and deeply, deeply elegant gallery. I did not tell him the whole, sordid story of the dinner. I did not need to. I was a scholar, presenting a case to a fellow expert. I simply and quietly laid out the evidence. The cancelled dinner, the work emergency, and a single, small, and utterly and completely damning piece of paper. The receipt from the restaurant for my own, solitary, and deeply, deeply sad birthday dinner, time-stamped at 8:45 p.m. The same restaurant at the same time that my daughter was celebrating her new, and much more important, mother. David, a man who had known me and my family for 40 years, a man who understood the subtle and brutal language of the social world we all inhabited, looked at the receipt, and then he looked at me, and his kind and intelligent and deeply, deeply loyal old face hardened. "She has breached the contract, Eleanor," he said, his voice a low and quiet and deeply, deeply furious rumble. "The patron's clause is as clear and as binding as a signature on a canvas. She has failed to demonstrate loyalty and respect, and in doing so, she has forfeited her claim. So what do we do?" I asked, though I already knew. "We do," he said, a slow and deeply, deeply satisfying smile spreading across his face, "what any good curator does when a masterpiece is in the hands of a vandal. We repossess it." The plan was a masterpiece of quiet and legal and deeply, deeply satisfying elegance. We did not send a threatening letter. We did not engage in a messy and public legal battle. We simply and quietly invoked the power of the trust. A week later, a formal and very, very polite letter was sent to my daughter, Lily, from the office of the trustee of the Sterling Family Heritage Trust. The letter was not from me. It was from David. It was not a letter from a heartbroken mother. It was a letter from a deeply and profoundly disappointed art dealer. The letter was a work of art. It was a quiet and deeply and profoundly brutal masterpiece of legal and emotional jujitsu. It began by praising her deep and abiding love for the family's artistic heritage. It then, with a deep and profound and utterly and completely false regret, informed her that, due to a recent and very generous offer from a major international museum, the trust had decided that the Bronzino painting was too valuable and too historically significant to remain in a private collection. The letter went on to inform her that, as per the terms of the trust, the painting was to be temporarily removed from her residence for the purposes of a full and professional and long overdue scholarly and financial appraisal. It was a brilliant and deeply, deeply dishonest move. A lie told in the service of a greater and much, much more beautiful truth. The phone call from Lily came that evening. She was not angry. She was ecstatic, triumphant. "Mother, you will not believe it," she squealed, her voice a symphony of pure and unadulterated and deeply, deeply misinformed glee. "My painting, the Bronzino, it's going to a museum. David Chen says it's historically significant. He says it's valuable. Can you believe it? My dusty old painting. It's famous." She was a fool, a beautiful and greedy and completely and utterly and gloriously clueless. Fool. How wonderful for you, darling, I said, my voice a perfect and deeply, deeply satisfying purr of maternal pride. The next day, 2 professional and very, very discreet art handlers from David's gallery arrived at my daughter's apartment. And they, with a quiet and professional and deeply, deeply satisfying reverence, removed my painting, my treasure, my dowry, my weapon, from her bedroom wall. And they brought it, not to a museum, but to the climate-controlled and very, very secure vault in the basement of David's gallery. The repossession was complete, and my daughter, in her blissful and greedy ignorance, had not just allowed it, she had celebrated it. The trap, the beautiful and elegant and deeply, deeply satisfying trap, was now set. All that was left was for the final and most beautiful and most satisfying part of all, the appraisal. The 2 weeks that followed the repossession of the Bronzino were for Lily a period of giddy and deeply, deeply misinformed anticipation. She was, for the first time in her life, the center of a story that she believed was about her own, newly discovered importance. She would call me, her voice buzzing with a self-satisfied excitement. David Chen says the initial assessment is very promising, Mom, she'd announce. He's bringing in a specialist from Sotheby's. Can you imagine? Ike Sotheby's. I would make the appropriate, encouraging, and deeply, deeply disingenuous sounds of a proud mother. How wonderful for you, darling, I would say. I always knew that painting was special. She was a fish, a beautiful, glittering, and fantastically stupid fish, who had not just taken the bait, but was now happily and eagerly helping to set the hook. The final act, the grand and public unveiling of the truth, was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon. David had arranged a formal appraisal meeting at his gallery. He had invited Lily, of course. He had, at my quiet and firm suggestion, also invited her father, my ex-husband, Richard, and his new and very wealthy wife, Caroline. And as a final, beautiful, and deeply, deeply strategic touch, he had invited the arts editor from the city's most influential newspaper. They arrived at the gallery, a small, powerful, and deeply, deeply arrogant family unit. They were not there for an appraisal. They were there for a coronation. They were there to witness the transformation of their daughter, their stepdaughter, from a pretty and socially well-connected young woman into the owner of a major and very, very valuable work of art. The meeting was held in David's private viewing room, a quiet and deeply, deeply intimidating space with gray flannel walls and a single, perfectly lit easel. On the easel, draped in a piece of black velvet, was my painting. David, a master of a quiet and deeply, deeply effective kind of theater, began. He spoke for a few minutes about the history of the painting, about its provenance, about the quiet and unassuming genius of the artist. And then, with a slow and deliberate and deeply, deeply satisfying gesture, he removed the velvet cloth. The painting, even to my own familiar eyes, was breathtaking. It was a small, perfect, and deeply, deeply soulful portrait of a young and unknown Florentine noblewoman, and it glowed. It seemed to hum with a life, a history, a beauty that was 500 years old. The specialist from Sotheby's, a man with a quiet and deeply, deeply authoritative voice, then spoke. He spoke of the brushwork, of the use of color, of the painting's historical significance. And then he came to the final and most important part of his assessment: the value. Taking into account the recent market for works of this period, the impeccable provenance, and the, frankly, miraculous condition of the piece, he said, his voice a low and deeply, deeply respectful purr, we would estimate the current auction value of this painting to be in the range of $7 to $10 million. The number, the beautiful and terrible and utterly and completely world-shattering number. It hung in the silent and suddenly very, very small room, like a supernova. I watched as the blood drained from my ex-husband's face. He, the great and powerful and deeply, deeply shrewd businessman, had, in our divorce, dismissed this painting as a minor and sentimental asset. He had, in his arrogance, in his greed, and in his profound and deeply, deeply satisfying ignorance, let a $10 million masterpiece slip through his fingers. And Lily, my daughter, her face was a mask of pure and unadulterated and deeply, deeply ecstatic joy. She was not just a pretty and well-connected young woman anymore. She was a millionaire, 10 times over. She was, in her own and very, very small mind, the star of the greatest story ever told. And then, David Chen, my friend, my ally, my trustee, delivered the final and most beautiful and most satisfying plot twist of all. "It is indeed a masterpiece," he said, his voice a quiet and deeply, deeply apologetic and utterly and completely merciless instrument of pure and final justice, which is why it is with the deepest and most profound regret that I must inform you that it is no longer yours. The silence that followed David's quiet and devastating pronouncement was a work of art in itself. It was a perfect and absolute and deeply, deeply satisfying silence. Lily's ecstatic and triumphant smile did not fade. It froze. It became a grotesque and permanent and deeply, deeply pathetic rictus of a joy that had just, in the space of a single terrible sentence, been murdered. "What?" she whispered, the word a small and broken and deeply, deeply confused sound. "What are you talking about? It's my painting. It was my mother's gift to me." "No, my dear," David said, his voice now a thing of pure and quiet and deeply, deeply satisfying sadness. "It was not a gift. It was a guy patronaging, and the terms of that patronage, the terms of the trust you signed, but so clearly never bothered to read, were conditional." And then he laid it out. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply and quietly, and with the devastating and irrefutable authority of a legal document, read the patron's clause. He spoke of the requirement of familial loyalty, of personal respect. And then he produced his own, final, and most beautiful piece of evidence. He produced my receipt from my own solitary and deeply, deeply sad 60th birthday dinner. "On the evening of your mother's 60th birthday, Lily," he said, his voice now a quiet and terrible and deeply, deeply just instrument of judgment, "you were not with her. You were, in fact, at this very same restaurant, celebrating the birthday of your new stepmother. An act that I, as the sole and final arbiter of this trust, have been forced to define as a profound and deeply, deeply, and irrevocably breach of the condition of respect and of loyalty." The collapse was not loud. It was a quiet and internal and utterly and completely complete implosion. Lily simply and quietly, and with a small and almost inaudible whimper, slid from her chair and onto the floor in a heap of a very, very expensive and now deeply, deeply meaningless designer dress. Richard and Caroline did not move to help her. They were frozen in their own private and deeply, deeply satisfying hell of a $10 million mistake. The journalist, his eyes wide with the pure and unadulterated joy of a man who has just been handed the greatest and most scandalous story of his career, was scribbling furiously in his notebook. I did not stay to watch the aftermath. My work, my final and most beautiful act of patronage, was complete. I simply stood up and I walked out of that gallery, out of that life, and into the quiet and beautiful and deeply, deeply satisfying and now very, very wealthy rest of my own. My old life ended that day in a quiet and very, very expensive art gallery. My new life began the next morning with a single and deeply, deeply satisfying phone call. The story, of course, was on the front page of the society section the next day. The Patron's Revenge. A $10 million lesson in familial loyalty. It was a masterpiece of a scandal. My daughter, my ex-husband, his new wife, they became, overnight, the laughingstock of the very world they had tried so hard to conquer. They were not just greedy and cruel. They were fools. And in their world, that is a sin that is never, ever forgiven. I never spoke to any of them again. They disappeared from my life, erased by the beautiful and brutal efficiency of their own public humiliation. And the painting? The beautiful, and now very, very famous Bronzino? It did not go to a museum. Not at first. I, with my $10 million, and with the quiet and deeply, deeply satisfying counsel of my friend, David, established a foundation. It is called the Patron's Fund. And we do one simple and beautiful thing. We find young, brilliant, and struggling female artists and art historians, the kind of women who are so often in the loud and arrogant and deeply, deeply male world of art overlooked, and we become their patrons. We give them grants. We give them studio space. We give them the one and most precious and most beautiful thing in the world, the freedom and the support to create. And the Bronzino now hangs not in my home, but in a small and beautiful and light-filled gallery we have established to showcase the work of our foundation's fellows. It is the first thing you see when you walk in. A quiet and beautiful and deeply, deeply powerful reminder of the enduring and eternal and often very, very brutal relationship between the artist and the patron. This evening I am hosting a small dinner. My guests are the first 3 recipients of the Patron's Fund. They are brilliant, they are passionate, and their eyes shine with a pure and unadulterated and deeply, deeply beautiful and deeply grateful love for the work they are now free to do. I learned in the cold and lonely and deeply, deeply humiliating silence of my own personal betrayal, a profound and a beautiful and a beautiful and a deeply, deeply satisfying truth. The greatest and most beautiful and most enduring work of art you will ever have the privilege of owning and of patronizing is your own and beautifully and gloriously independent life. And that is a masterpiece that is truly and utterly and completely priceless.